I mix what I like, what I like. Mix what I like is exactly where you want and need to be. I mix what I like, organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. Get healthy. Get healthy. I mix what I like, what I like.
We're here on I Mix What I Like. You may check us out on imixwhatilike.org, where you can see all these other shows and what my daddy liked and other cool things.
Hey, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like, right here at I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. And even if my browser lags, the sound seems okay, so we're all good. Welcome, everybody, to those who are able to join us here live. Please do like, share, subscribe, do all of the things. Patreon, join the channel, put this in your socials. Have another very good, very interesting discussion lined up for you, so looking forward to it. And welcome. There is something else that I wanted to say that I'm forgetting, so we'll just move on and stop standing on ceremony and get to my guest, who, among other things, is co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, of which I am also a member. He is a convener of the Working Group on Syria, Media and Propaganda, associated researcher with the Working Group on Propaganda and the 9/11 Global War on Terror, member of Panda and BerlinGroup21 as well. He researches and writes on propaganda, conflict, and media, and was the chair professor in politics, society, and political journalism at the University of Sheffield. He's been a senior lecturer of international politics at the University of Manchester, and also a lecturer in political communication at the University of Liverpool. And I am, of course, talking about Dr. Piers Robinson. Piers, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Good to be with you, Jared.
So there's a lot to get to that you've been involved with directly that we are going to talk about. But as we were discussing just a little while ago, I thought we would start with just a sort of broad question again around why propaganda. You know, it's a term we hear all the time. It seems to be thrown around routinely. So why is there a need for such a focused study on propaganda as you see it?
Yeah, well, I'll kick off. You listed a nice long list of organizations and things I'm involved in. I'm of course, now I'm working as a research director for the International Center for 9/11 Justice. which is really carrying on all propaganda-related work and so on. But I just wanted to add that in there. That's sort of a current focus of my work. But it does all come back to, my research interest in propaganda and why it's important to study. I think probably in some ways I had not a dissimilar journey from you, in the sense that, I was raised as an academic in the field of communication studies. And of course, I overlapped with international politics and foreign policy. And a lot of my early work was looking at debates such as the CNN effect debate, which was this idea of media, CNN, but other media driving foreign policy decisions in places such as Somalia and Bosnia. And, as with any young academic who learns how to jump through hoops and get on and so on, you find yourself molded in terms of looking at certain research questions, focusing on certain parts of the equation, as it were. And, in communication studies, a lot of that is looking at media content, framing, audiences, interaction with policy, and so on and so forth. And also, as you move into more critical realm, the Herman and Chomsky kind of manufacturing consent analysis, looking at the way in which the media is influenced by political and economic power. And this was, as it were, sort of my main sort of base for studying and looking at the world and looking at international politics, looking at foreign policy. And of course, in all of that, there's no, in a lot of the sort of broad academic research, there's, not an awful lot on propaganda. And I think for me, it was following the Iraq invasion in 2003. I'd spent a lot of time looking at media coverage of that war. And the bias and the framing of that media reporting. And then, of course, as we all know now, there was a lot of controversy started to emerge over the Iraq invasion in 2003 about the weapons of mass destruction, and this idea that we perhaps hadn't been told the truth, that no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq after it was invaded. And it started to come onto my radar a little bit that there was, that there's some big questions here. Has there been a major deception by governments, by the US government and also the British government, over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And there was really from about 2003 onwards this ongoing controversy. You had Dr. David Kelly, the biological weapons expert in Britain, who wound up dead, but had also spoken to the BBC and said, well, the government were manufacturing or manipulating the intelligence. You had a similar process going on in the United States with Ambassador Wilson, who was basically saying that the Bush administration hadn't been completely straight about the intelligence. And as inquiry after inquiry sort of rolled on, more information came out that there was a lot of manipulation of the intelligence. And that was the point at which I kind of shifted from looking at the kind of traditional areas of media content, audience reception, and so on, and started to look at, okay, let's look at the manipulation of information even before it gets to the media. Let's look at these networks and organizations which are set up within the bureaucracy in order to essentially manage perceptions, as had been the case with Iraq. And I think it was looking closely at, with a colleague, Eric Herring, looking at the way in which the British government and the intelligence community had massaged intelligence on Iraq in order to give the impression that Iraq was a credible current weapon of mass destruction threat, that I started to realize, wow, there's a whole architecture of essentially manipulation of information going on behind the scenes. And and then that's when I started to be introduced to people such as David Miller, our colleague, who was talking very openly about propaganda. We essentially have a high level of information manipulation going on. And so that sort of kind of phrase I use about only part of the equation. You can look at the media, you can look at how journalists act, you can look at media output and so on. But if you're missing that process in which information is being manipulated by governments, by spin doctors, by PR agencies and so on, you're not really getting to the bottom of essentially how power is being exercised through communication. So I think it was that experience with Iraq and looking at the manipulation of intelligence, seeing all this evidence that was coming out because of the inquiries which were emerging and so on, that I realized that, okay, this is really where we should be turning our attention as scholars of communication, that if we're not getting to grips with propaganda and the way in which powerful actors manipulate information and do that systematically, then we're not really getting a very strong handle on what's going on. And I think, now living in an era where propaganda, the term, is more frequently thrown around than in previous years, although still being directed at particular political actors and less attention to, our own governments and mainstream politicians, etc. But the reality is, and as we know from the history of propaganda and Eddie Bernays and the transition into public relations, propaganda has been part and parcel of how democracies have been functioning for a very long time. And so on. So it becomes, for me, the big question. We've got to understand propaganda. We've got to understand how it works in order to understand how power is being exercised, in order to understand how people might be being deceived or coerced and so on. And, I think I'm glad to see that there is more attention now from some parts of the academy to propaganda than, say, 5 years ago when we set up the Organization for Propaganda Studies. But, so there is some improvement there. But this is, I hate to say this is the only thing we should all be studying, right? Because, that's always unfair. But this is, if you're interested in political science, if you're interested in what's happening in the world, then unless you start to get to grips with propaganda, then you're sort of adrift at sea, I think, in terms of your understanding. So this becomes a priority research area, I think.
No, one of the things that I'm relatively late to is just the history of how much energy and effort those in sectors of power have spent in not only producing propaganda, but studying it, studying its effects, studying its prevalence in societal discussions. So it's somewhat fascinating and a little bit spooky, pun intended, to think of how often reference could be made to the term, but it just be sort of taken for granted. It's just sort of passingly, yeah, everybody does propaganda. There's not much thought into, well, what exactly does that mean, and so on. So, but one question, because it just so happens that this past week or two, I've been doing a number of interviews focused on, in some way, the CIA in this country. An article you published recently in Propaganda in Focus and UK Column makes reference to the MI6, which, as for a lay person's understanding, I've always equated with this country's CIA, is more or less, yeah,
correct.
And yeah, and so before we sort of segue to that, but I've been asking each of these folks I've been talking to what, because in the most recent interview, Herb Boyd and Don Rojas were talking about their study into the CIA's surveillance of Black radicals in this country. But they paused for a second at the beginning of the book to give caution to what it means to engage in such study, because the information you get has to be taken with several grains of thought and put in certain context. My point is, I've been asking everybody something about methodology. So when you engage in the work you've been doing around for years around, whether again from 9/11 and beyond to more recently Syria, and you have to engage MI6 or other like entities including just general news media. How do you proceed methodologically, or do you give any caution, or how do you prepare students or anyone else for that sort of endeavor? Just to say, how do I assess what I'm getting into here?
Well, I mean, this is, in a sense, it's not just an intelligence agency problem. When you study propaganda, it's, if you're just looking at PR agencies, propaganda tends to, when people are manipulating information, they don't tend to want people to know about it. And that's the same for a PR company or a political party or for the intelligence services. So you do essentially, you have a very opaque network. And it's difficult to penetrate and get an understanding of. And that means you do, I think, as you're hinting at, as a researcher, need to tread very, very carefully. That sort of getting sort of hard information on some aspects of what you're doing is going to be very difficult. So, if you're a happy clappy political science researcher and so on, studying the Democrat Party or the Republican Party or whatever political party, you can probably get quite a lot of interviews, and there's probably quite a lot of documentation which is, automatically into the public domain and so on. And so, it's quite easy to get that kind of evidence base and so on. When you're looking at propaganda, and especially when you're looking at propaganda in relation to intelligence agencies, it's not that it's a complete sort of black hole which you can't see. You can detect things, but you have to proceed cautiously, and you have to, as with all of these things, you just have a much higher level of uncertainty, I think, and that should lead you to be more cautious in claims that you make and so on. So I think, that is, but critically, just because we can't see some of these things very clearly, such as the deep state, right? It doesn't mean that it's not there, and we can't show that it's there through actions and various observable implications and so on. So I think as much as we have to have this kind of degree of caution and so on, we also have to say, okay, it's a difficult thing to study and we're going to have a lot of uncertainty about it, but it's essential that we do. Otherwise, going back to my first point, we're not going to make much progress and so on. I think the other component of this, I'm not sure if you were getting at this, for people studying this, okay, you see, you're talking about intelligence agencies. They have a lot of power. And, as a researcher, I think, does it put you in danger? I don't really think in those terms, but as we'll probably see with the experience that we had on the work in Syria, what is that phrase that was used about Trump, 9 ways from Sunday to get him, or whatever? I've forgotten who it was, but it was a comment a year or so back about, the CIA have got a whole arsenal toolkit that they can smear you and get you taken out. And I think that's in some ways what you come up against when you're studying or involved with looking at intelligence agencies. But also more generally, I think when you're pressing into these areas where there is propaganda, and not all propaganda is not synonymous with deception, but deception is a one kind of element of propaganda. You are inevitably pushing yourself up against powerful actors who will retaliate against you. Smear you. So
I wasn't even getting. I wasn't meaning to even get that far with it. Although who knows? And but I was thinking just initially because for instance, the two I just mentioned were doing research on the CIA's surveillance of Malcolm X in one point, and the CIA said they only had 71 pages on when we just know, for instance, someone else that we talk to routinely around here, Daruba bin Wahad, they had like 200,000. So the idea you only have 71. So sorry, like, what do you really, and then some of the pages they send, of course, the redaction is almost entire, the entire page. So it's in other words, you never know, even when you think you've had access to something or they say something to you, it's always difficult to know, well, what are they saying? Why are they saying it? Why is this what they're revealing as opposed to what they're not revealing? that's before we even get to the part where they're responding, even just in terms of what they, yeah.
And do you know what, that goes through my mind actually an awful lot, especially with the work on Syria, which we'll probably get to. Why are we finding out about this now?
Yeah.
And you think as a researcher, you think, oh, this is great. This is an exciting and research vein, and and interestingly enough, this information is kind of being leaked in here and there and so on. But then you think, well, is it a strategic release of information? And they're throwing you a bone, and you go chasing after it, and so on. And it can all be real, but it's a misdirection exercise. We're never going to get away from that problem. I think if that was the kind of the core of your question, it is always going to be this. Okay. We've peeled away at the onion. We're getting a better idea, but have we been pulled away from another issue? How much deception might there be weaved into this information being put out? It's that's.
But there's a level of
inheritance.
But there's also and also what I'm getting to, and then I will turn in here to the specifics, but and I put the link, folks, to the article I'm about to reference in the show description, titled "Attacks on Academic Freedom: The Times of London and MI6." And lastly, here I'm really thinking about my students, and who in this day and age are wildly susceptible to any number of messages and frames put on stories and events happening in real life. And it's very easy to reach conclusions with very little effort or study or research. And so when I turn to this article and what you're bringing attention to, one, if you could just update us on that, and then as folks will see more when they read the article and follow up more, that one of the ways, at least, to balance or protect or insulate oneself from the levels of difficulty that you were just describing is research, is some degree of investigation before. And in fact, in the video, I think you encouraged me, one of the recent video, the debate or the argument you were having at one point on I'm not even sure, honestly, the outlet.
Sky News, was it? Or?
Sky News, yeah. All you simply were really arguing was we should have some caution. We should learn based on some past failures, have an investigation. And you were just, I even think, did he call out your mother or something in there?
Yeah, he said, who do you think was responsible for the chemical weapons attacks in Syria? And your mother. So he brought my mother into it.
So well done for not, having a different response, but it was wild. And it was just, and that's all you were really advocating. You hadn't made any particular assertions or anyway. So turning to that, what is this latest? And then we can get to some of the broader arguments around what this has meant for academic freedom and so on and so forth. But yeah, please,
yeah. I mean, maybe the easiest way is just to give a very, and I will be strict on myself and give a very brief introduction. I mean, I've written a lot on this issue, but essentially, back in 2017, 2018, myself and a number of other academics were starting to study Syria and the war in Syria, and to look at propaganda in relation to Syria. And one of the areas that we were interested in were the chemical weapons allegations that the Syrian government was systematically using sarin and chlorine chemical weapons against its population. And we'd started work on this and really hadn't published much at all. But the Sky News interview that you're referring to was an interview which occurred shortly after an alleged chemical weapons attack in Duma, Syria in 2018 in April. And this alleged attack occurred. There was quite a lot of sort of commentary on social media. Some people were saying this doesn't look genuine. Others, such as the French, British, and American governments, were saying Syria did it, and there was the war drums were going to attack Syria. And that's when I gave the interview on Sky News, and I was up against Alan Mendoza, who was the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, a neocon organization. And I was saying, well, let's wait for the inspectors to get in. The Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons were going to deploy a fact-finding mission, team of inspectors to look. I said, well, let's wait for them to have a look before we bomb anyone. They didn't wait. They bombed the next day. In fact, Friday, they bombed Syria in retaliation for this chemical weapons attack being pointed at the Syrian government. And funny enough, not funny enough, but as they were bombing Syria, myself and my colleagues were put on the front page of the Times of London and described as apologists for Assad, conspiracy theorists, questioning chemical weapons attacks, and so on. There was an editorial in the Times calling for our jobs effectively. And then a couple more articles in there with some nice pictures of us as well on the inside pages. And this is the Times of London, right? This is a major newspaper, mainstream newspaper in the UK. So at that point, I was thinking, gosh, we're right over the target. Why on earth would they be panicking to this degree that a bunch of not particularly well-known but credible academics, we're all at Russell Group universities, which are like, the Ivy League elite universities in the UK. Why should they be going to so much effort to basically try to destroy our reputations and even get us fired, right? So we thought we're going to press on with this. So when the OPCW fact-finding mission issued its first report in June of 2018, we realized that there were a lot of problems with the report. So we went ahead and we issued a briefing note in the summer of 2018 saying, look, all of these facts don't add up. What the British and American French governments saying about what happened in Duma doesn't make sense for these reasons, and so on. And we issued that briefing note. And then, that was in the summer of 2018. Fine. The attacks continued. We were continually getting attacked. I was being attacked by the Huffington Post. I'd say a limited thing about 9/11, for example, and that would be in a newspaper article in the Huffington Post. And then the situation changed because a year later, the final report was issued from the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and it basically pointed the finger, to all intents and purposes, at the Syrian government for having carried out the attack. And we read the report, we wrote a review of it, and we said this still doesn't make sense. This is these chlorine cylinders bouncing off floor onto beds, 43 civilians turning up dead, apparently dropping dead from chlorine on the spot. None of these things really made sense. But this is when the issue became, as it were, much bigger, because at that point it emerged essentially that people involved in the OPCW investigation had been dissenting about what was going on in the investigation, that there'd been an act to suppress information that the team who deployed to Duma had found. And essentially two OPCW officials, as Brendan Whelan and Ian Henderson, essentially, were making internal protests. And then over the course of 2019, a lot of information came into the public domain. Stuff came out through WikiLeaks. An OPCW official gave a briefing to an international panel in Brussels in the autumn, basically saying that the OPCW's investigation was manipulated in order to point the finger at the Syrian government. And it was manipulated by, for example, suppressing key information. And just to give you a little bit of example, one key piece of information was that these 43 civilians who were found dead in an apartment block in Duma, apparently having dropped dead on the spot from chlorine gas, well, the NATO toxicologists who were asked to analyze that said, this is not chlorine gas. These people were not killed. If there was a nerve agent, that might cause them to all drop dead, but not chlorine gas. And there was no evidence of any nerve agent. Only chlorine gas was being claimed to be the weapon used. And these toxicologists said that this would not happen. That information was buried and suppressed in the final report, and that was one of the issues that these scientists who were blowing the whistle effectively were raising. And then it really has been going on since then, that there has been this has been occurring at UN Security Council level. It's been occurring within the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, this ongoing controversy over the manipulation of this investigation. The scientist whistleblowers who are saying, yep, it was manipulated, and trying to get the OPCW, but also France, Britain, and America to acknowledge and recognize and to allow, for example, a proper reinvestigation of what happened at Duma. And that is still going on now. And so now I work alongside Jose Bastani, who was the first Director General of the OPCW, Hans von Sponeck, former Assistant Secretary General of the UN, and then Professor Richard Falk, representing essentially the issues raised by the whistleblowers, and trying to get accountability. So that's the story. And in terms of the bigger picture, this is, and it doesn't take too long to figure this out. But sorry.
Well, I know. I'm sorry. I just want to, because even as I said, I just reread the article, but I don't follow this. But even just rereading this and hearing you break it down again, I just want to be clear, because I remember at the time that all of this was happening. Again, this isn't my particular area. I just don't follow these things carefully enough. I don't read enough on it. So I just am cautious about what I think I understand about what's happening. But I remember as this was all unfolding on national media or international media, it did seem, wherever I heard that there was some criticism around the story, it immediately, even I start thinking, this sounds like a movie. What do you mean 43 people are found dead and now we don't even know what? But in fact, 43 people had been killed. So the question was, how and by who? We're all in the world being told this is Assad gassing his own people again. And again, even in that, and I'm sorry, that was where I was I found the link to that video in the article that you had linked it there, with Mendoza. But he's just saying, regurgitating again. The media were just in general regurgitating that it was an again and again and again, which for me calls into question all of that. I don't know, there wasn't even enough time in that discussion with you to get into the question of, well, what is he actually accused of? Under what circumstances? Who's accusing him? I'm not defending him. I'm just saying we're just hearing it as it's taken for granted of what a horrible person he is, which led to the conclusion that you and anyone else raising any questions should just be just condemned along with him. But you, in tracking with others so you're saying it's still not been concluded who exactly was responsible and in what way even these people were killed? That's really where I wanted to get immediately. Yeah.
Well, in terms of what happened in Duma, there is no evidence to support. There's no strong evidence to support that the Syrian government carried out this attack. Okay, so all the indicators of helicopters dropping gas cylinders and people dropping dead, etc., none of that adds up. So you don't have evidence of an attack. What you do have are proxy groups of the West, such as the White Helmets, who are claiming this is what happened. Groups who are on the ground who are involved in both filming these scenes and also in the burial of the bodies as well from this building, making these claims. We've been attacked. Assad has attacked us. Assad has attacked us. White Helmets is obviously, linked to the UK government, and we'll get into the kind of propaganda operation that we came to understand was going on in relation to this. But you have these claims being made. They're dovetailing with what the British and French and American governments are saying. Assad did it. Here are the pictures. Here are the images. and so on. But the OPCW investigation, before it was manipulated, was essentially coming out saying, well, there isn't clear evidence of this. And if there's no clear evidence of an attack, then what do you have? You have something which is being staged, which is being presented as an attack, a false flag, essentially. Doesn't mean that it's completely faked in the sense that nobody's dead. There are dead people and so on, but it's essentially being staged and set up in order to pin the blame at the Syrian government. And the thing is, this isn't just an isolated. It's not just a Duma. The whole context of the Syrian war has been these repeated allegations, starting with Ghouta 2013, of the Syrian government using chemical weapons against its population. Mm-hmm. Duma is where the wheels came off this, because people within the OPCW, I suspect, just became fed up at the manipulation that was going on and effectively blew the whistle. But this was going on through all of the investigations. And as soon as you look at, and as I have been doing in depth, look at all of these alleged attacks, and you start to look at the investigations, you see the same problems coming up. You have sources on the ground aligned to Western powers making these claims, the OPCW going in and not doing a proper investigation, being essentially, deferential to the claims being made by the British, French, and American governments, just rubber stamping, yep, okay, that's probably the Syrian government and so on. But when you look and you drill down, look at the details, you see the same problems coming up. These are manipulated investigations. So this is a large scale, as I describe, a strategic deception in relation to Syria. In exactly the same way that we invaded Iraq off the back of manipulated intelligence saying that Saddam Hussein has chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction that he can use. That was a lie. In Syria, they invoked the same narrative to try and finger the Syrian government for possession and use of prohibited weapons, chemical, biological weapons. And that was a propaganda campaign, which wasn't just manipulating the intelligence, saying he's producing it. It was a propaganda campaign which involved the use of proxy groups on the ground, primarily the white helmets, in order to stage these things. And again, some of these events, when you look at them, it doesn't take you don't have to engage in an awful lot of scrutiny to see that these are not authentic events which are occurring. But when you have the mainstream media and the Western governments, pouring out the propaganda and so on, any kind of critical questioning gets completely drowned out. So that's where we are in terms of the bigger picture. I'm confident in saying that, as we've seen again and again with early investigations, that these are staged events. Duma, the critical question of how these people died. I mean, I'm not going to get into the realm of speculation. What I will say is that these civilians did not die in that apartment block from chlorine gas. And if they were not killed that way, then the question arises, okay, how were they killed? We know that Jaish al-Islam were in control of the area at the time. The white helmets were responsible for burying the bodies. And we also know that several thousand prisoners were being held by Jaish al-Islam in underground tunnels in Duma at that time. So it doesn't take, it's not a hugely complicated issue to think through, okay, what might well have happened there with these civilians and so on. Atrocities happen in wartime. So that's roughly where we are with the kind of the picture on Syria and chemical weapons. And this is something which for some people, because they are so exposed to the propaganda that we've had on this and the promotion, think that sort of this guy's talking conspiracy theory and so on. But when we look at the facts, when we do the detailed research, we can show that these are primarily staged events. And it's a strategic deception, and it is involved, obviously, people being killed as part of these events. And that's the ugly reality of this.
So just quickly going back to that previous question, so could you talk just for a second? How did you go from the story being reported to any inaccuracy being discovered to these are, as you're saying, staged events? How does one get there? Or how did you get there?
How we got there, I mean, in a sense, the operation in Syria regarding the chemical weapons has involved a network of outsourced organizations funded by the British government. They include the White Helmets, who were headed by the late James Le Mesurier, a former British military officer. There's IncoStrat, set up by Paul Tilley, former British military officer, who were providing public relations for Jaish al-Islam. You have Hamish de Bretton Gordon, former British military officer, but setting up a private company called Biosecure, and then working to collect samples on one occasion during an MI6 operation, and then feeding that information into the OPCW. So what we started to learn was that actually there are a network of UK government-linked actors, former military personnel working for these essentially outsourced organizations, and the White Helmets, who are primarily involved in managing perceptions in relation to the Syrian war. And I've got a couple of book chapters written on this, which document all of these outsourced organizations. It goes back to, there's a big organization called ARC, which was set up in 2011, I think. Don't quote me on that. Again, British military officers, some linked to intelligence services, setting up these organizations to get information out of Syria, to provide public relations to Jaish al-Islam, who are fighting the Syrian government. This large architecture or network of essentially propaganda operations coming from the British government. And so this is what we started to learn as we were looking at these alleged attacks, looking at the OPCW investigations, and then finding, for example, well, look, the primary sources that the OPCW reports are drawing upon here are the White Helmets. Okay, and the White Helmets are, and then as more documentation came out, oh, James Le Mesurier is working with the head of the White Helmets in order to select witnesses to pass to the OPCW. So, right, okay, so you've got a very corrupt kind of research process going on there. Or another way of putting this, you have the opportunity for information to be manipulated, which is then being passed up to the OPCW. And all of these things became more and more transparent in a sense because of the controversy within the OPCW and the information that was coming out there, but also for us as researchers, because these people started to attack us directly. We started to become, okay, so right, we understand what's going on here. And so, for example, the Times newspaper was attacking us, and then James Le Mesurier actually fell to his death 2 weeks after an OPCW official gave testimony about the manipulation of the Duma investigation. He fell to his death in circumstances which, at least to my mind, are unclear. But we know from the Times newspaper columnist Oliver Cam, who tweeted out rather stupidly, he mentioned that James Le Mesurier had commented upon the academics and had asked the Times to keep the pressure up on the academics. So that's when we started to see, well, okay, so James Le Mesurier from the White Helmets is talking with the Times, and the Times newspaper is attacking us. And then, of course, it was around this period that evidence of the Integrity Initiative emerged. And the Integrity Initiative was a UK government-sponsored propaganda operation trying to create clusters of journalists, government officials, in order to combat mainly Russian propaganda, as they described it. And some of the journalists who were involved in attacking us in the Times newspaper were turning up in these Integrity Initiative documents which had been leaked. So in a way, this kind of level of understanding of, actually, we're up against an organized propaganda operation, more than just these events in Syria with actors on the ground doing things which might be nefarious. This is actually linked back to the UK government, became painfully obvious at that point, and so on. And now we know, and just as one final nugget, and this is mentioned in the article, James Le Mesurier's wife, Emma Winberg, who was very unhappy with the academics as well. She, in the Politico Europe article a year ago, a journalist who had been writing the story of her life and James's life, said that, well, she told me on several occasions she worked for MI6. So, and that was published in Politico. I think Emma tried to get legal action to stop them from publishing, but they went ahead. They said no, and that article is still out there. So, it's not often that you get that we started your early question about how do you know these things when you're looking at things. Our problem, or perhaps this is the advantage we had possibly, but we were stepping all over an active propaganda operation, and they were trying to shut us down. Perhaps we'll come on to this, the smearing of academia and so on. And in the act of trying to shut us down, ultimately they exposed themselves. They exposed themselves through the Times newspaper. The fact that James Le Mesurier died under unclear circumstances, and that was blamed initially by some commentators on us, the academics, saying you drove him to his death. He was so upset that you were questioning what he and the White Helmets were doing in Syria, that he was, that one didn't fly for very long, and so on. But we were stepping all over a hornet's nest, and as those hornets came for us, more and more information essentially came out and got us to a point where, I've written book chapters on this, and writing a full book on the Syria chemical weapons issue now. The evidence is there. The final thing, and I'm going slightly on about this. No, the other thing about these outsourced propaganda operations, and again, if we get them into your show notes, people can go and read the book chapters. One of the downsides of outsourced propaganda operations, the upside for governments is that there's some kind of distance from government. Yeah, it's not the Foreign Office, and it's not MI6 delivering propaganda. The propaganda is going through these outsourced, still run by ex-UK military, but there is this kind of, it's not us doing it kind of thing. So it creates more greater plausibility. The downside of this is that these outsourced companies, these guys and girls running these organizations, they leave a paper trail through company's house, through the registered businesses. And one of my colleagues in the working group, Paul McKee, was going through all the company house records and seeing all of these sort of organizations which were popping up, some of them which weren't filing returns and so on, and actually broadly, which were raising a whole series of questions about, how much salary, how much pay these former military people were taking for themselves, British taxpayer money, and so on. But it just leaves this paper trail. You can see quite clearly because it's all in company's house. So the outsourcing also creates a degree of exposure, I think, which allowed us to, in a sense, link up and say, okay, so this guy leaves the military. He then sets up a company as an injection of money, and then some documents were leaked. You can see money coming from the Foreign Office going through and being allocated to these companies and so on. So the paper trail is there, and there you get the unusual circumstances where actually a propaganda operation starts to become quite exposed. But it's exposed because a poor bunch of academics stamped all over it, and then reaped the whirlwind, which we'll come on to, for having what can I say, stumbled upon this and stumbled upon these events, which again, I don't want to get into too much of the details, but I'm pretty confident James Le Mesurier was aware of what was really happening on the ground when they were arranging witnesses, because we know from the inconsistency in the witness statements, he was. I think it's very likely he was aware that some people were being killed for the purposes of a staged event. It would be kind of extraordinary if he wasn't conscious of that, and so on. So I think the problem for the British government is that they're running these operations. Some of them are involving people who are getting murdered on the ground by groups such as Jaish al-Islam and so on, and then served up. And that's a very dirty secret. And I think that's one of the reasons which explains the degree of ferocity with which the British authorities have attacked us over many years.
So just one more silly question. Forgive me for this one, but what if you're concocting a mass murder that you're going to tell a story about to blame on someone else, why wouldn't you be able to be more consistent with the method there? In other words, why would you come up with the chlorine story if you know that the scene isn't going to corroborate that? Why wouldn't
Yeah.
they couldn't have found a way to blame Assad for whatever method was used?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm conscious of time.
Yeah,
I
I know.
don't
I'm
take
sorry.
up
I'm
too much
sorry.
time.
Yeah.
If I'm going into too much detail, please do tell me.
No.
One of the issues about Duma was that the victims were foaming at the mouth. They appeared to be foaming at the mouth and so on. The scene had all the characteristics of a nerve agent attack. Yeah. And I suspect that was the intention, was to present a nerve agent sarin attack. Okay.
Okay.
Now, what happened was that whoever was supposed to lay the traces of sarin at the apartment block was unable to do that. They failed to do it. And remember, this is a conflict situation. Syrian forces were encroaching upon Duma. They were taking back the areas. The area fell within a couple of days, which is one of the reasons why an OPCW team was able to get in on the ground for the first time in many years to actually do an investigation. For whatever reason, they had the thing set up to look like a sarin attack. But the sarin didn't arrive. They weren't able to get that spread throughout location 2, the apartment block. And so they had to run with a different narrative, which is that it's chlorine had to have done this, because the OPCW team are not going to find any sarin, and they would have found sarin traces if sarin had been used, and so on. So these operations don't go according to plan. Yeah. And so on. And and again, if you go back and look at earlier attacks, I mean, I could go into a lot of detail on earlier attacks, and where you have one crater which is acknowledged essentially as staged and another crater 50 feet away at the same time. But it will take this one as real. This was a real attack, but at the same time, they were faking a crater over here. And this is all meant to be happening at the same. This is absurd. It doesn't make any sense at all. These operations, because they know that there isn't going to be any serious scrutiny from mainstream journalists, because they're just deferring to the official narrative, they're not going to ask these obvious questions, and so you can get away with a lot. But I think with Duma, I think it was intended to be presented as a sarin event. This is why you have this foam at the mouth and so on, which is one of the things that the NATO toxicologist said, that foaming at the mouth doesn't happen with chlorine immediately. It happens with a nerve agent, but not with chlorine. Why do these people have that from chlorine? It doesn't make any sense at all. The other thing, film from a white helmet, film from the following day, they pick up a young lad who's dead in the building, and the foam in his mouth is entirely rigid. And I've not been able to find any doctor who can find any explanation for that. So it looks as though it's been added. It's fake material which has been added to look like foaming at the mouth and so on. So that's, I think that's probably what happened with Duma. That's the most plausible explanation. There is some more information that I'm aware of, which I'm not going to put out in public domain at this point, which indicates that, that the scenario I've just painted is accurate and so on. But that's the most likely explanation of what you have there. You have a false flag, which is botched somewhat, carried out under a lot of pressure and rushed and so on. And then because the inspectors get in on the ground, they're able to do the investigation and find that there isn't sarin at the location, etc.
No, thanks. So I'm not entirely sure of the narrative in the UK, but in this country, the narrative is that academics are largely a bunch of liberals and have the freedom to do whatever they want, unless you're the president of a university and your students protest for Palestinians, then you might be in some trouble. But other than that, that's the general, and that academics largely lead a life of, again, liberal privilege. So what is this concept, this idea that there would be an attack from the state against academics, and then and then at another level or from another angle, the academic institutions themselves turn on individual academics employed there? Why would this even occur, or how are we supposed to assess or believe that this would even occur. Anyway, in your case, and your colleagues in the UK.
Yeah, well, I mean, the learning curve on this one, in a sense, if I'm following you correctly in where you're going with this question, I mean,
It was
I
a little
wrote a piece
convoluted. Sorry
back in
about that. Yeah.
2003 with Eric Herring about, you
Mhm.
take Herman Chomsky's propaganda model, which I know we're both very familiar with.
Mhm.
You apply that to academia, and actually those filters kind of fit.
Damn
You know,
near perfectly. Yes.
damn near a few modifications in there and
Mhm.
so on. And so, academia is subject to these pressures. There are pressures not to upset governments. Academics can get subjected to flack, which is exactly what we had. If you think of the flack filter with Herman and Chomsky, that's exactly what we got. It was academics, they're exposing an ongoing MI6 operation in Syria. And so we'll get our pals in the media of the Times to make their life hell and so on. So it really highlights the fact that all of those pressures, which we know and we have documented in the case of mainstream media, and people such as you and I have, built academic careers out of attacking the media for its failures. This applies to our own being as academics in institutions. And so what that means is that just as the mainstream media doesn't do the job it's supposed to be doing, the same goes for academia, that there are powerful constraints on what we can think, what we can do. And when we do cross that line, this is the other kind of good point that Chomsky makes. And I think Michael Parenti made this point before Chomsky, to saying, people think that they're free. Yeah, going about, I'm being really critical and so on, but a dog only knows that it's tied, leashed to a pole if it walks far enough away and starts to feel so and so on. So in academia, a lot of academics think we are independent, but they never really get into these territories where they really are challenging power. And then you start to you incur the wrath of the authorities and so on, as we did with the Syria issue and so on. And so, we're not free in the way that we thought we were. Liberal academia is not this space where people are allowed to think critically and to also, push boundaries as well and so on. That's a myth. Whether it was ever like that, I don't know, but we know that ideally, in the ideal type, is that's what it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be able to research what we think is necessary and important to get to the truth and so on, and to be free to do that, and not, if you ask as you mentioned, the Sky News interview, you ask some eminently reasonable questions. It's not clear how this attack happened. Let's wait for an investigation, etc. But if you do that as an academic, you shouldn't expect to find yourself on the front page of a newspaper saying you're an Assad apologist, and so on.
Or worse, that your own family is carrying out the attacks. I mean, that was, again, that's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. So, and of course, this is and you're familiar with this in your own research field. We come up against these barriers, and in a sense, I think a lot of us, and a lot of we're quite well disciplined, right? There's a reason why they call them academic disciplines. Yeah, we know as you go through a system and you learn to get on, and you learn I want to get promoted, etc. I think we do learn to be quite well behaved, unfortunately, because of just the kind of internal dynamics of academia and so on. It's a pretty well disciplined bunch of people and so on. And so you're up against that, and then if you push any further outside of that, and if you're still operating within the system, then the big guns start to be opened up on you, such as media attacks and so on.
So, but that was sort of what I was
getting your colleagues. Sorry, go on.
No, that was, well, I think I interrupted you right where you were about to go, because there's what I was trying to get at initially was this, that on the one hand, we're conditioned to think that academia is not a threat to state power, and they're just these aloof liberal academics just studying to be studying to talk with one another. And then on the other hand, when there is the kind of attack that you all suffered from abroad, from media and beyond, there's a notion that the institution is supposed to protect the academic freedom of its individual scholars, faculty. So could you talk a little bit about what you experienced there in terms of the institutional, or even or again, you started to even be saying there that that colleagues may be hesitant to take positions publicly or elsewhere in defense, well, maybe that's not where you were, but could you talk a little bit about what happened with you all? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm normally quite sort of cautious about running through my own experience with the university where I was a professor at. So I left that university in 2019, and in general, I felt supported during the attacks from the Times, for example. I don't think that there was no question of me being fired, for example, or even when I mentioned 9/11, where I reviewed David Ray Griffin and Elizabeth Woodward's book on the consensus panel. There's no suggestion of get them out and so on. So I felt generally quite supported. However, I would qualify that by saying that in general, whatever university I was in, I think when you get into these controversial areas and you end up on the front page of a newspaper, the wind, the temperature gets a little bit cooler, and you can kind of like sort of read, certainly the PR department is thinking, this is great, you're in the news, but can we have you in the news for something else? So, I think at the very least,
they do catch everything. I'm sorry, the PR departments of universities don't miss a lot. So
they're scrutinizing all of the social media and so on. So I think you have that kind of problem. But some of my colleagues, I mean, obviously David Miller, who was involved with the Syria working group as well, and was being attacked in parallel. He was at the same time being attacked by the Zionist lobby trying to get him fired. And of course he was fired. And I think and I'm sure you will speak to David at some point, he will say that he's very unhappy with the University of Bristol because it completely failed to protect him from what was manifestly a smear campaign, using the anti-Semitism label in order to, denigrate him, etc. And then finally successfully got him fired on a kind of another issue to do with engaging with a student in public. I think it's the same kind of problem that Mark Crispin Miller had at New York University. You're being attacked by a student and then you respond, but you're disrupting the safe space for that student and so on. But he was certainly, Bristol University embarrassed themselves in terms of their complete failure to protect David. And of course, he's won his industrial tribunal for being wrongfully dismissed, although I believe it's going into appeal. So, he obviously the institution did not defend him in that case. I mean, Tim Hayward is at Edinburgh. I think he feels that he's been fairly well protected by his university, but David not, obviously at Bristol. I think, more broadly, as you mentioned, the Palestine, Gaza, and the genocide that's going on at the moment, sort of opposition and challenges to that, I think is difficult on the US campuses and so on. It's certainly the case in Germany and the UK, where academic institutions aren't defending the rights of academics to speak out on these issues, to act as public intellectuals. I know it's not a topic you're particularly focused on, but kind of the COVID-19 event, and there were a lot of medical scientists who were opposing the policy responses to that and who ended up out of jobs and so on. So there's, I think Jay Bhattacharya, I think he's still in post, but Martin Kulldorff was pushed out of Harvard, and this happened to other academics and so on. And again, they, in a sense, they were saying, well, this is my opinion, this is my considered judgment on what's going on, and they found that they were found they're getting smeared in the media, and they found also that some of them were losing their jobs. I guess this runs across, the gender issues as well, that we have playing out, this kind of lack of tolerance for people who oppose and challenge particular arguments and so on. And I think, you know, the big picture here is that, you know, that there is, we're in a dark age, I think, for that kind of principle of commitment to academic freedom, freedom of expression, the right for you or I to sit down at the table and say, oh, this is my honest, considered assessment and so on. Let's discuss and so on. There are topics which are forbidden and so on, which we're not allowed to move into and so on across multiple areas, I think. 9/11 is a good example. Obviously, we work on focusing in on that very much these days. But yeah, we have a cancel culture, right? I mean, you have experience of this yourself, I think.
Well, yeah, but but I probably wouldn't phrase it in that way, because well, for me, there is a sort of overly simplified right-left dynamic to it. So the cancel culture, I'm not entirely sure. Well, for me, that phrase is always taken on a certain conservative bent in this country to suggest that right-wing conservative white males are being shut down. And that's just not, I don't see that. But I think there's always in this country in particular, a general hostility to intellectualism. There is obviously, I've argued, following some of the work of people that we've talked about here today, that this country is the most heavily propagandized society in human history. That's, you know, debatable, but that's so. But my point is that there is an absolute attempt to narrow and limit and frame and manipulate public opinion, and that certain forms of expression are shut down across the political spectrum, depending on the context at different periods of time. So yeah, so in this country, you know, I've seen, you know, there could be some, as much as there could be argued to have been an effort to shut down certain arguments around, as you said, policy discussions around COVID, or you know, people saying what they're saying about the vaccines, and there has been, I think, a more consistent and persistent attempt to cancel any array of left-wing politics in this country, more sustained and, you know, more aggressively than anything else. But all of that to say, I in general agree with what you're saying, and more importantly, I do, maybe even to a fault, agree with the idea that there should be no institutional punishment for people sharing their thoughts, even ones that I don't agree with. I don't think people should immediately or at all lose their jobs for raising certain questions, or and even if I don't even know about the professors you mentioned at Harvard, but you know, even if I don't agree, or even if I do, I don't know what they were arguing. I don't like the idea that people would lose their jobs over it. But I'm just mostly familiar with the history of those jobs being lost because people are advocating something more to the left about the state of affairs here. But again, yeah. So anyway, that's it. That's all I wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally I agree with you. I mean, I think, you know, there is, but it is context specific. I think, you know, over the last 6 or 7 years, I mean, you know, people questioning Syria, for example, we were hit hard and so on, and debate closed down. People questioning COVID-19, the same happened. People questioning Palestine, Israel, the same thing happening, and so on. You know, there's a generalized problem there. But as you say, tendencies with particular groups, and I think, you know, American history. And I don't know. I mean, you know, if we think of propaganda defined very broadly to include, you know, actions in the real world and coercive actions, think of the assassinations of the 60s, Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. You know, there is, all of those are, you know, I would argue these are deep state events and so on. But that's about controlling public perceptions and shutting down political movements and so on.
Sure.
And and that's what we've got, I think, in the West. You made this point about what people assume is these liberal, defended, autonomous institutions, but we don't have that. We have corrupted institutions, and which are bent by power and suppressed by power, and that's been going on for a very long time. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, sort of about JFK assassination. Is it almost mainstream now that he was Lee Harvey Oswald was not the prime lone gunman?
I don't know. I mean, every time I think it has, I end up hearing some. I don't know. I feel like I hear somebody make reference to no. The opposite, that they revert back to no. Oswald is just taking
okay.
So I don't know. I honestly, I don't know. I don't know to what extent. And then to be fair, I'm in the circles I'm in, it would be taken for granted. But every time when I peek out into sort of the rest, I don't know. It's sometimes people. So I don't know. Yeah, it should be. I would think at this point, but I don't know.
I suppose in the extent that obviously Robert Kennedy was pretty clear. Robert Kennedy Jr. was pretty clear, wasn't he? Was it last year? He said CIA did it. And so on. So I suppose in a sense of, that issue getting into a kind of a mainstream political sort of zone of, you can say that 9/11 still being in the zone.
Yeah, but they use that against him too, though. Because remember, I mean, because especially recently, they'll add that to the list of things. In fact, I read one not too long ago that that was negatively aligning all of what could be made fun of events in his life, from the bear and the park and all these other kinds of things. And then if you just add to that, and then he said, by the way, that the CIA killed his father. In other words, my point is the reference to it can be made and framed in any number of different ways. And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know to what extent. I don't know. Maybe I'll poll my students next week and see, just to see what some young people think. I
don't know. My guess is that there's a lot more awareness about that than amongst the younger generation. I think the same. My experience working on the 9/11 issue with IC 911, there's a lot of awareness that the official story on 9/11 is not accurate, and that's putting it mildly, so on. So this kind of. But I think the point I was trying to make, going back to Kennedy, if these things are as they are, some people are claiming them to be, then we are in a pretty sticky corner in Western democracies. If JFK was assassinated by the CIA, that's a coup, right? And then one question you could put to a political scientist, if you get to go through all the evidence, say, well, have we actually had a democracy since then? If that is what happened at that point, and the answer would be no.
Yeah, I mean, for some of us, it is a hard no. It's yeah. So it's that's why, again, and I increasingly am more overt about this, but this is, again, I talk about my students a lot, that this is where I try to employ my own principle or call for methodology, because what I think I understand about the history of this country, the idea that the CIA would have assassinated Kennedy to enact or to reinscribe some power is not it's not difficult. It could have even been said to be in some ways predictable, but but I have to also acknowledge that maybe relative to lay people, there's been a good amount more, but I wouldn't call myself an expert on these in terms of research on these subjects. So that's why I just encourage people to be more, mindful of where we all are, and then work a little harder to clear up some of the blind spots, including investigating versions of that we might find challenging to our own biases. So that's really it. Just checking my bias at the door here a little bit, or acknowledging it at the door here. That's all. Because
and it's important to remain committed to sort of good academic principles of trying to be objective, careful, detailed research and so on, and all those kind of basic sort of 101 of research design and so on. Using those skills and those toolkits in order to arrive at better positions and understanding of what is going on and so on.
Can I ask? Oh, sorry. I know you said you got to run in a second.
I'm okay for an hour and a half is good. I think.
Yeah, we got. Well, so we have in a few more minutes. I do see some all-stars in the chat here. The chat, of course, are all stars, but I'm just catching a question here from Orasami Burton, Professor Burton. Can Dr. Robinson comment on how we should think about academic scholarship that uncritically draws on state political communication, i.e. propaganda, as the evidentiary basis for making claims? I think this is a more well-written version of a question I tried to raise earlier, if I'm getting it correctly. Actually, no, it's not. Actually, it's a better question altogether. So academic scholarship that is published that draws upon state political communication uncritically for the basis of its claims. How do you think we should think about that kind of scholarship?
Well, I think it's a very big problem in scholarship, and actually, one of my colleagues, Tim Hayward at Edinburgh, he's doing a lot of work on this. He's just set up a course on propaganda at the University of Edinburgh. Got himself in the Times newspaper, surprise, critically about that. But he's also working on a book, and it is about academia and propaganda, and it's about trying to get academics to understand that there is much a target of propaganda operations as the public are, and so on. And so try and get academics to start to realize, okay, not only should you be very careful about using mainstream media as a source, for example, in research that you're producing, you also need to be very careful about information coming from governments, but also be very cognizant of the fact that, there are large-scale propaganda operations from governments pumping information out, aiming at academia, aiming at the public. And if you're not acknowledging that, I always try not to come across as too cruel, but you end up being part of the propaganda machine if you don't exercise due diligence and do what you just said. Think critically, use your own skills, use your own research skills and skills of logic in order to evaluate information and treat everything with great caution. And this is a lesson which I think, I know Tim Hayward is very keen on encouraging academics to learn this, and then hopefully that will improve their work. But it's a big problem. It's there, and I think academics need to learn. Hopefully, Tim's book will help academics to learn the skills of navigating a highly propagandized environment and stop being part of the problem, as it were, by simply relaying it. But that happens. It's a good question because it happens across the board. The numbers of times I pick up and read a mainstream article on Syria, and the starting assumption, chemical attacks being carried out by the Syrian government. And there's no awareness of the controversies and so on. It's just stated as an assumption.
Or sometimes they'll even start off with official sources say. They'll even be worse. And they'll say official sources say. And then they'll just run off with it.
9/11.
No,
you will not find in international relations scholarship, you will find almost no academic articles asking questions about the official narrative. The starting point is the official narrative. And so you have the entire field of critical terrorism studies, which I was somewhat involved in with setting up a journal when that was started. You won't find any articles which question the official story on 9/11. It was carried out by Al-Qaeda and so on. And so, academics shouldn't be doing that. We should be scrutinizing our assumptions before we proceed. And if we think there are good grounds, that looks about right, we'll work with that and so on as a starting assumption for our research, fine. But if you don't even question or go through that process, then I think you're not really doing your job as an academic.
Look, I keep saying that, a version of that's why I think the state attacked Aaron Schwartz and others like him so heavily, because what he was exposing by initially just hacking and allegedly and delivering without permission academic research out to the community, what he was threatening was the fact that the state sees that what we as in academia publish is theirs. It's for them. We may be thinking we're doing it for our career, but we're providing research for them to take advantage of, even when we're writing something radical or critical. That was one thing. And the other thing I thought of immediately when I was reading Professor Burton's question to you is, isn't that what Robert Redford was doing in 3 Days of the Condor? Anybody remember that movie? Not that we should be using movies but I just think I think of this movie a lot, actually. And I think his job in the movie is to be writing and assessing what is written in non-academic popular culture spaces that might reveal what the state was up to. So it was like he was like helping produce the unofficial official narratives that people in society. And then I won't say anymore. I think folks should go watch that film if they haven't seen it, or should we rewatch it. But I think that speaks to Burton's question in a way, that if we're not paying attention, we may very well easily be producing or working with what is produced to help propagandize. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Listen, Professor Robinson, thank you very much. Make sure, is there anything else you wanted to make sure we brought up or said or re-said before we wrap? And if there are any other pressing questions from the audience, please throw them up. Otherwise, we can start to close. Did you freeze? Oh no! Did you hear? No, I was asking. Did you have anything else you wanted to get to?
Sorry. Yeah, I thought you were going to throw up a question.
No. I didn't.
Yeah,
no.
Yeah, I think to wrap the whole thing up, I mean, I think studying propaganda can get you into an awful lot of trouble, and I'm a case study of that. But at the same time, I mean, on the Syria issue, we've stood our ground. As I said at one point, working with Hans and Jose and Richard Falk, and the issue is still is there at the international level, and so on. There's a stalemate on it, but it does feel like that, even though it's been a very hard path to go down, it does feel like I do kind of personally feel I've done my job as an academic to try and keep the historical record straight, and that's as much as I can do, and so on. So it's a good feeling. So even though it gets a bit miserable when your mum's being brought in and you're on the front page of the Times and so on, I think these things are worth doing, even though there's a lot of pain that goes with it, and so on. And I encourage other academics to be, in a sense, courageous, as I know you are in your field. But be courageous, and don't just think about career promotion and jumping through the hoops. Also think about sort of keeping the historical record straight, and having the confidence to go out there and do that. So it's not a hopeless task. So as I keep on saying in recent weeks, is it truth is the daughter of time, not of authority. That's Francis Bacon. Stuff does come out in the end. Propaganda campaigns come to an end. Those pushing narratives, these break down at some point, and so on. And we can be there as academics, getting the truth out there. There's hope.
Well, right on. And I thank you very much for this discussion and for the work. And folks can follow with more from you in the show description, where your bio and link to more of your work is, and the article in question, at least one of them. And thanks again. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Great to be with you, Jared.
All right. Right on. Take it easy. All right, everybody. Big shout out to Professor Piers Robinson. Again, please check the show description for more on his work and more. Thanks for coming through to those who are here live. Blood Honey, sorry I missed your question. We'll pick up on that another time. But thank you for coming through. One quick shout out to Mystery Monk. Glad to be here. Found y'all randomly. Well, right on. Welcome, welcome. Please, everybody, do like, share, subscribe, do all of the things to support the platform, the channel, and ring the bell, do all of those things. And yeah, appreciate you. I enjoyed this discussion as well. All right, everybody, you know the deal. Peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And catch you next time right here at
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
What do you sacrifice? Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, they set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy and defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything, 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 everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.